Hey folks, before the video starts, please leave a like and subscribe to cheer me up. Make sure you are relaxed and enjoy today's stories. My parents used to travel to different city every month. I found on the deep web why. I've always thought my parents were a bit strange, but I figured that was just how parents are. You know, everyone's got their quirks, but as I got older, I started noticing things that just didn't add up. My parents have always been really private people. We lived in a small town, the kind where everyone knows each other and nothing much happens, the type of place where people leave their doors unlocked and gossip about who's dating who at the grocery store. But my parents never seemed to fit in with that small town vibe. They didn't have many friends, never really joined any community events, and kept to themselves for the most part. But the thing that always stood out to me the most was their travel routine. Ever since I can remember, my parents would leave for a trip at the beginning of every month. Like clockwork, they'd pack their bags, tell me they'd be back in a few days, and then head off to some city I'd never heard of. It was always a different place. Sometimes it was big cities like New York or Chicago, but other times it was some tiny, obscure town in the middle of nowhere. They never took me with them, which, as a kid, really bugged me. I'd ask where they were going or why I couldn't come, and they'd just brush it off with some vague excuse like, "It's for work," or "We need some time alone." I'd try to get more details, but they were always tight-lipped about it. Eventually, I just stopped asking. I figured it was some adult thing I wouldn't understand. As I got older, their routine didn't change. Even when I was in high school, every month without fail, they'd disappear for a few days. It became just another weird thing my parents did, like eating dinner in complete silence or never talking about their childhoods. But what really started to bother me was how they acted when they came back. They always seemed off, like not just tired from traveling, but genuinely disturbed. They'd be jumpy, easily irritated, and would avoid eye contact with me for days. And it wasn't just once or twice. This happened every single time. They'd eventually snap out of it and go back to their usual reserved selves. But those first few days after each trip were always tense. It wasn't until I moved out for college that I started really thinking about how strange it all was. I mean, who travels to a different city every month for years without any explanation? And why did they always seem so on edge when they came back? I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong, but I didn't know what. During college, I tried to push those thoughts to the back of my mind. I had my own life to focus on, new friends, new experiences, but every time I called home, the routine was still the same. I'd ask my mom how they were doing, and she'd mention their latest trip, never giving any details, always sounding a little too casual about it. One night, after one of those conversations, I was hanging out with some friends in my dorm. We were talking about weird stuff our families do, and I mentioned my parents' strange travel habits. Everyone thought it was bizarre, and one of my friends joked that they were probably spies or something. We all laughed it off, but the idea stuck with me. What if they were doing something not normal, not just odd, but something genuinely bad? The thought kept nagging at me, but I didn't know how to even begin finding out. My parents weren't the type to leave clues lying around, and it wasn't like I could just ask them. I tried to let it go, but I couldn't. That's when I started digging around online. At first, it was just basic stuff, searching for their names, looking up the cities they traveled to, trying to find any connections, but I didn't find anything. No social media presence, no mentions of them anywhere. It was like they didn't exist outside of our little town. Frustrated, I started going deeper. I'd heard about the deep web from some of my friends, places where you could find information that wasn't accessible through normal searches. I knew it was sketchy, but I figured it was my best shot at finding out what my parents were really up to. I downloaded a Tor browser and started poking around. At first, it was just a lot of random creepy stuff. Drug markets, conspiracy theories, hitmen for hire, which I really hoped was just a scam, and other things that I probably shouldn't have been looking at, but nothing that gave me any answers. Then after a few days of searching, I found something. It was a forum, hidden deep within the layers of the deep web, that seemed to be dedicated to tracking. Well, I wasn't really sure what at first. The posts were cryptic, with people talking about events and sightings in different cities across the country. There were threads discussing different locations, dates, and strange occurrences. Things like unexplained disappearances, sightings of odd figures, and mysterious deaths. The more I read, the more uneasy I felt. The cities being mentioned started to sound familiar. I grabbed a map and began to compare the locations. My heart nearly stopped when I realized that every single one of those cities was a place my parents had visited. And then I found a thread that changed everything. It was titled, "The Travelers, Who Are They?" The posts were vague, with people sharing stories about encountering strange people who seemed to show up in their towns, always around the same time that something bad happened. Some described them as a couple, others as a small group, but the details varied. What didn't vary was the pattern. These people would arrive, stay for a few days, and then leave. And every time they did, something terrible would follow. I scrolled through the thread, heart pounding, until I found a post that made my blood run cold. It was a detailed account from someone who claimed to have seen the travelers up close. They described them as an ordinary-looking couple, unassuming, quiet, but with an unsettling presence. The post ended with a chilling line. "They're always there before the bad things happen. It's like they're drawn to it. Or maybe they cause it." I stared at the screen, my mind racing. I didn't want to believe it, but deep down, I knew. The description matched my parents perfectly. I was too afraid to read more that night. I shut down my computer and sat in the dark for a long time, trying to convince myself that it was all just some weird coincidence, a misunderstanding, but the nagging feeling in my gut wouldn't go away. I needed to know more, but I didn't know if I was ready for the truth. After that night, everything changed. I couldn't get the idea out of my head that my parents, the people who raised me, might be involved in something dark, something beyond my understanding. I tried to go about my life as usual, but it was impossible. Every time I talked to them, every time I thought about them, I felt this gnawing dread in the pit of my stomach. I avoided the deep web for a few days, hoping the fear would subside, but it didn't. If anything, it got worse. The more I tried to ignore it, the more obsessed I became with finding out the truth. I knew I had to do something, anything, to get some answers. One weekend, I decided to go back home. It wasn't unusual. I visited every couple of months, and my parents always seemed happy to see me. But this time was different. I wasn't going just to see them. I was going to find out what they were hiding. I arrived on a Friday evening, and everything seemed normal. We had dinner, made small talk, the usual stuff. but I couldn't shake the feeling that they knew I was up to something. They were a bit more guarded than usual, their smiles a little too forced. Or maybe I was just paranoid. Either way, I knew I had to be careful. That night, I waited until they were asleep before I started my search. I crept down the hallway, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't have a plan. I just knew I had to find something, anything, that would explain what I'd seen on that forum. I started with their bedroom, carefully opening drawers and closets, trying not to make any noise. But everything looked normal. Clothes, old receipts, random trinkets. Nothing unusual. I was starting to think I'd made a mistake when I noticed a small leather-bound journal tucked away in the back of their closet. It didn't look like much, just an old notebook, but something about it made me feel uneasy. I took it back to my room and opened it, my hands shaking. The first few pages were normal enough, just lists of things they needed to pack for their trips, notes about hotels, flight details, that sort of thing. But as I flipped through the pages, the entries started to change. They became less about logistics and more strange. There were notes about the cities they were visiting, but not the kind of notes you'd expect. They weren't about tourist attractions or restaurants. They were observations about people, specific people, names, descriptions, places they'd been seen, times they were likely to be alone. I kept reading, and the entries got darker. There were references to targets and coded phrases that I couldn't quite understand, but the intent was clear. They were tracking these people. And then there were mentions of events. It took me a moment to realize what that meant, but when I did, I felt sick. The events were the terrible things that had been happening in those cities. Disappearances, accidents, murders. There was no direct evidence linking my parents to any of it, but the way they wrote about these events, it was like they knew they were going to happen, or worse, like they were making sure they did. I flipped to the last few entries, and what I found there made my blood run cold. It was a detailed account of their most recent trip. They'd gone to a small town a few states away, and from what I could tell, they were watching someone, a man in his 30s who lived alone. The entry described his routine, his habits, and then, in chilling detail, how they'd planned to approach him. The last line was a simple, matter-of-fact statement. It's done. I couldn't breathe. My parents had been involved in something terrible, something far worse than I could have imagined. And the worst part was, I still didn't understand why. What were they doing? Why were they targeting these people? And how had they gotten involved in this in the first place? I sat there for hours, reading and rereading the journal, trying to make sense of it all. But the more I read, the less I understood. The entries were so clinical, so detached. It was like they were just following orders, going through the motions. There was no emotion, no remorse, nothing to indicate why they were doing this. Eventually, I put the journal down and just stared at the wall, my mind racing. I knew I couldn't confront them about it. Not yet anyway. I needed more information, something concrete that I could use to understand what was happening. That night, I barely slept. Every noise in the house made me jump, and I kept expecting to hear footsteps outside my door, to see my parents standing there, knowing I'd found their secret. But the night passed without incident, and when morning came, I knew what I had to do. I needed to go back to that forum. I needed to find out more about these travelers and what they were involved in. I had to know if there were others like my parents, and if there was any way to stop them. I made an excuse about meeting up with friends and left the house as soon as I could. I drove to a nearby coffee shop, opened my laptop, and logged back into the deep web. I found the forum again, my hands trembling as I navigated to the thread about the travelers. This time, I read everything. I didn't skip over any posts, didn't let my fear stop me. The stories were horrifying, but they also gave me some clues. People who had encountered the travelers described them as calm, methodical, and always one step ahead. There were rumors that they were part of some kind of organization, something that operated in the shadows, out of sight from normal society. But there was one post that caught my attention more than any other. It was from someone who claimed to have escaped the travelers. They didn't give many details, but they mentioned one thing that stuck with me: a name. The Black Room. I didn't know what it meant, but the way the poster talked about it made it clear that it was important. They said that the Black Room was where everything started, where the travelers were trained, where they were given their missions. It was a long shot, but it was the only lead I had. I had to find out what the Black Room was and how my parents were connected to it. But before I could start searching, my phone buzzed. It was a text from my mom. "Where are you? We need to talk." My heart skipped a beat. How could they know? I tried to calm myself down, telling myself it was just a coincidence, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I had no choice. I had to go back home and face them. I stared at my mom's text for what felt like an eternity, my mind spinning with possibilities. Did they know I'd found the journal? Were they onto me? The thought of going back home made my skin crawl, but I didn't have a choice. I couldn't let them know I was scared. I needed to play it cool, act like everything was normal. I took a deep breath, replied with a simple "on my way," and closed my laptop. As I drove back home, my mind raced with questions. What was the Black Room? How deep were my parents involved in this? And most importantly, what was going to happen when I walked through that door? When I pulled into the driveway, I noticed something was off. The house felt different, almost like it was holding its breath, waiting for something. The curtains were drawn tight, and there was an eerie stillness that made my skin prickle. I walked inside, trying to act natural, but my heart was pounding in my chest. My parents were sitting in the living room, waiting for me. Their faces were unreadable, but there was something in their eyes that set off alarms in my head. "Sit down," my dad said, his voice calm but firm. I hesitated for a moment, then did as he asked, lowering myself onto the couch opposite them. "What's going on?" I asked, trying to sound casual, but my voice came out more strained than I intended. They exchanged a glance, and for a second, I saw something flicker in my mom's eyes. Fear, maybe? Or was it regret? But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by the same cold, detached expression I'd seen too many times before. "We've been meaning to talk to you," my mom started, her voice unusually soft. "There are things you need to know. Things we've kept from you for your own safety." My stomach twisted into knots. This was it. They were going to tell me everything. But was I ready to hear it? "We've noticed you've been curious lately," my dad added, his gaze piercing into me. "And that's dangerous for all of us." I swallowed hard, my mouth suddenly dry. "Curious about what?" "About our trips," my mom said, her tone turning colder. "About the things we do. We didn't want to involve you, but it seems like we don't have a choice anymore." My heart was pounding so hard I thought they could hear it. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, but all I could manage was a shaky, What are you talking about? My dad leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper. There's a place, a facility, called the Black Room. It's where we were trained, where we learned everything we know. The Black Room. Just hearing the name sent a shiver down my spine. Trained for what? I asked, though I was terrified of the answer. For our missions, my mom said, her voice emotionless. We're part of a network, an organization that deals with certain individuals, people who need to be dealt with. What do you mean, dealt with? I asked, my voice trembling. My dad sighed, rubbing his temples as if the weight of the world was on his shoulders. It's not something you can understand easily. The people we target, they're dangerous. They're a threat to society. What we do, it's necessary. Necessary? I echoed, horrified. You're talking about killing people. It's not that simple, my mom snapped, her calm facade cracking. These people, they're involved in things you can't even begin to comprehend. We don't make the decisions, we just carry them out. I felt like the floor was falling out from under me. My parents weren't just travelers, they were killers, part of some shadowy organization that decided who lived and who died. And they'd been doing it for years. Why are you telling me this now? I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. Because you become a liability, my dad said bluntly. You've been digging where you shouldn't be. We tried to protect you, to keep you out of this, but now... He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. I knew what he was saying. Now that I knew the truth, I was a threat to them, to their missions, to the organization, and they couldn't afford that. Is this why you texted me? I asked, dread pooling in my stomach. To deal with me? My mom's eyes softened for a moment, and I saw a flash of the woman who had raised me, who had loved me. We don't want to hurt you, she said quietly, but we can't let you interfere. I didn't know what to do. My whole world had been turned upside down in the span of a few minutes. The people I thought I knew better than anyone were strangers, monsters hiding behind the masks of my parents. I won't say anything, I said, my voice trembling. I won't tell anyone, I swear. My dad shook his head. It's not that simple. They'll know. They always know. Who? I demanded. Who's they? The ones who run the Black Room, my mom answered, her voice flat. They're always watching, always listening. If they find out, you know. She didn't need to finish the sentence. I understood perfectly well what she meant. If they found out I knew, I wouldn't be safe. Not from them, and not from my own parents. What do we do? I asked, feeling utterly lost. My dad looked at my mom, and they shared a look that seemed to communicate more than words ever could. Then he turned back to me, his expression hardening. You need to leave, he said. Tonight. Get as far away from here as you can. Don't contact us. Don't go back to your apartment. And for God's sake, don't go online. They'll track you. But where do I go? I asked, panic rising in my chest. Anywhere, my mom said urgently. Just keep moving. Don't stay in one place for too long. We'll try to buy you some time, but... She trailed off, and I could see tears welling up in her eyes. For the first time in my life, I saw my mom look genuinely terrified. Go, my dad urged. Now. I didn't argue. I grabbed my keys, my wallet, and bolted for the door. As I reached the front steps, I turned back to look at them one last time. They were standing in the doorway, watching me with a mix of fear and sorrow. Be safe, my mom called after me, her voice breaking. I didn't reply. I just got in my car and drove. not knowing where I was going, only that I had to get as far away as possible. My mind was racing, 1,000 questions and fears all colliding at once. Who were the people running the black room? How did my parents get involved? And most importantly, what would happen to me now? I drove for hours, the events of the night replaying over and over in my mind. I knew I couldn't stop. I couldn't go back. My life as I knew it was over, and I was being hunted by something far more terrifying than I could have ever imagined. As the sun started to rise, I found myself on an empty stretch of highway with no idea where I was or where I was going. I pulled over to the side of the road, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I couldn't keep driving. I needed to think, to plan my next move. But as I sat there, staring out at the empty road ahead, I realized something chilling. In my haste to leave, I hadn't checked to see if I was being followed. A wave of panic washed over me, and I quickly looked around, scanning the road for any sign of another car. But there was nothing, just me and the endless highway. For now, at least, I was alone. But for how long? I sat there on the side of that empty highway, the weight of everything crashing down on me all at once. The rising sun was a stark contrast to the darkness inside my mind, a constant reminder that time was slipping away. Every second I sat still felt like a moment closer to whatever was coming for me. The fear was almost paralyzing, but I knew I had to keep moving. I started the car and pulled back onto the road, my eyes constantly flicking to the rearview mirror. Every distant car seemed like a threat, every flash of headlights a warning. My parents had told me to run, to disappear. But where could I possibly go that they wouldn't find me? They had trained for this. They knew all the tricks, all the places someone might hide. And I knew nothing. I needed to think, to come up with a plan. But my thoughts were a mess, jumbled and tangled by panic. The only thing I could think of was getting off the main road, finding somewhere I could lay low for a bit and figure out my next move. I took the first exit I came across, winding through narrow country roads that twisted and turned, leading deeper into the middle of nowhere. The further I drove, the more isolated I felt, the trees closing in around me like a thick, oppressive wall. My phone had no signal, and the GPS was useless out here. I was well and truly on my own. After what felt like hours, I came across a tiny rundown motel, one of those places you see in horror movies where the rooms are probably crawling with bed bugs and the owner is some creepy old guy who doesn't ask questions. But right now, that was exactly what I needed. No questions, no attention, just a place to hide. I pulled into the gravel parking lot and killed the engine. The silence was deafening. My heart was still pounding, and I could feel sweat trickling down my back. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself, and then I walked into the motel office. The guy behind the desk looked exactly like I'd imagined, balding, with a stained undershirt and a permanent scowl. He barely glanced at me as I asked for a room, his eyes glued to the tiny TV in the corner, playing some old sitcom rerun. He handed me a key with a room number scratched into it, and went back to ignoring me. Perfect. The room was exactly what I expected, dim, musty, and depressing, but I didn't care. I locked the door behind me and collapsed onto the bed, my mind still racing. I knew I couldn't stay here for long, but I needed a few hours to rest, to think. Maybe if I could just sleep for a bit, I'd be able to come up with some kind of plan. But sleep didn't come. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my parents' faces, heard their voices telling me to run. I kept thinking about the black room, about the people, who were after me, and about all the innocent lives that had been lost because of whatever it was they were doing. I felt like I was trapped in a nightmare, one I couldn't wake up from. I don't know how long I lay there, staring at the cracked ceiling, before I heard it. At first, it was just a faint noise, something I almost didn't notice, but as I listened, it grew louder, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like someone gently knocking on the door. My blood ran cold. I held my breath, hoping it was just my imagination, but the tapping continued, steady and insistent. Someone was outside. I sat up slowly, my heart hammering in my chest. The room was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the neon sign outside. I could see the door clearly, the thin strip of light from the hallway seeping in through the crack beneath it, and the shadow of 2 feet just standing there. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was frozen in place. Who was out there? Had they found me already? My mind raced through possibilities, but none of them made sense. I hadn't seen anyone follow me, and this place was in the middle of nowhere. It couldn't be them. Could it? The tapping stopped, and for a moment there was only silence. Then a voice, low, calm, and chillingly familiar. "We know you're in there." My stomach dropped. It wasn't my parents' voices, but I recognized it all the same. I had heard it in the background of their phone calls, a voice they always responded to with a level of respect and fear I'd never understood. It was the voice of someone in charge, someone from the black room. "Open the door," the voice said, more insistent this time. "We don't want to hurt you. We just want to talk." Every instinct in my body screamed at me to stay put, to keep that door locked and barricaded. But I knew they weren't going to go away. They'd find a way in eventually, and when they did, I wouldn't stand a chance. I had to do something. But what? There was no way out of the room except through the door, and I didn't have anything I could use to defend myself. My options were rapidly dwindling, and I noticed the window. It was small, barely big enough to crawl through, but it was better than nothing. I moved as quietly as I could, trying not to make any noise that would alert them to what I was doing. The tapping started again, more insistent this time, as if they could sense that I was planning something. "We don't have all night," the voice said, a hint of impatience creeping into their tone. "You can make this easy, or you can make it hard. Your choice." I ignored them, focusing on the window. I pulled the curtains aside and fumbled with the latch, my hands trembling. Finally, it gave way, and I pushed the window open. The cool night air hit my face, and for a moment, I felt a surge of hope. Maybe I could get out of this. I climbed onto the ledge, glancing back at the door one last time. The shadow of the feet hadn't moved. They were still there, waiting. With a deep breath, I slipped through the window and dropped to the ground outside. The gravel crunched beneath my feet as I landed, but I didn't stop to look back. I took off running, my heart pounding in my ears. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to get as far away from the motel as possible. I could hear footsteps behind me, the sound of someone climbing through the window after me. They were fast, but I had a head start, and I wasn't going to waste it. The trees loomed ahead, a dense forest that might offer some cover. I sprinted towards them, the adrenaline pushing me faster than I'd ever run in my life. The branches scratched at my skin as I plunged into the undergrowth, but I didn't care. I just kept running. I could hear them behind me, crashing through the woods, their footsteps growing closer. My lungs were burning, and my legs felt like they were going to give out, but I couldn't stop. If they caught me, I knew it was over. The forest seemed endless, the darkness pressing in from all sides. I had no sense of direction, no idea where I was going, but I didn't dare stop. The only thing keeping me going was the sheer terror of what was behind me. Suddenly, I tripped over a root, crashing to the ground. Pain shot through my ankle, but I bit down on my lip to keep from crying out. I scrambled to my feet, but before I could start running again, I felt a hand grab my arm, yanking me back. I twisted around, ready to fight, but I was too slow. Another hand clamped down over my mouth, stifling my scream. I thrashed against their grip, but they were too strong. "Stop struggling," the voice hissed in my ear. "You're only making this harder on yourself." It was the same voice from the motel, the one that had been waiting outside my door. I couldn't see their face in the darkness, but I could feel the cold, calculated malice in their grip. "Please," I tried to say, but it came out as a muffled whimper. "Shh," they whispered, tightening their hold on me. "It's over now." Tears streamed down my face as I realized that I was out of options. They had me. There was no escape. But then, just as I was about to give in, something changed. The grip on my arm loosened, just for a moment, but it was enough. I jerked my arm free, spinning around to face my attacker. In the dim light filtering through the trees, I could just make out their silhouette, a tall, imposing figure, dressed all in black. I couldn't see their face, but I could feel their eyes boring into me. "You think you can run from us," they said, their voice dripping with disdain. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." And then, before I could react, they lunged at me. I barely had time to raise my arms in defense before they were on me, knocking me to the ground. I fought with everything I had, kicking, scratching, anything to get them off me. But they were too strong, too skilled. In a matter of seconds, I was pinned down, gasping for breath as they loomed over me. "You should have stayed put," they said, their voice cold and emotionless. "Now it's too late." I could see something in their hand, glinting in the moonlight. A syringe. My blood turned to ice. "No!" I gasped, trying to wriggle free, but their grip was like iron. They didn't say anything else. They just brought the syringe down, fast and precise, aiming for my neck. I felt the sharp sting as it pierced my skin, and a cold numbness spread through my body. Almost immediately, my vision blurred, the world fading to black as the drug took hold. The last thing I saw was their shadowy form leaning over me, watching as I slipped into unconsciousness. And then there was nothing. When I regained consciousness, everything was dark. The first thing I noticed was the cold, hard surface beneath me, followed by the dull ache in my neck where the syringe had punctured my skin. My head was spinning, and my mouth felt dry as sandpaper. I tried to move, but my limbs felt heavy, unresponsive. Panic began to creep in as I realized I couldn't see, couldn't hear anything but the faint hum of machinery in the distance. Then slowly, my senses began to return. The darkness wasn't complete. I could just make out faint shapes around me as my eyes adjusted. I was in a room, small and sterile, the kind you'd find in a hospital or some kind of laboratory. The air smelled of antiseptic and something else, something metallic and bitter that made my stomach churn. I tried to sit up, but my body felt sluggish, like I was moving through water. It took all my strength just to roll onto my side. That's when I saw it. A door, heavy and metal, with a small window set into it. Beyond the window, I could see a dimly lit hallway, but there was no sign of anyone. I wasn't alone in the room, though. As my vision cleared, I could make out the shape of a chair in the corner, and someone was sitting in it. They were dressed in all black, their face obscured by the shadows, but I didn't need to see them to know who they were. "It's about time you woke up," the voice said, cold and clinical. It was the same person who had taken me down in the woods, the one who had injected me. I tried to speak, but my throat was too dry, my voice barely a croak. "Where am I?" I managed to rasp out. The figure leaned forward, just enough for me to see their face, expressionless, with sharp features and cold, calculating eyes. "You're in the black room," they said, as if that explained everything. My heart skipped a beat. The black room, the place my parents had mentioned, the place where they had been trained, where it all began. I had found it, but not in the way I had ever imagined. "Why am I here?" I asked, forcing the words out. They tilted their heads slightly, studying me like a specimen under a microscope. "You've been causing a lot of trouble, you know, sticking your nose where it doesn't belong. We had to bring you in before you did something irreversible." "Bring me in?" I repeated, trying to make sense of what they were saying. "What do you want from me?" The person stood up slowly, deliberately, and walked over to a small metal table I hadn't noticed before. It was covered with instruments, scalpels, syringes, things I didn't even recognize, but knew were meant for one thing: pain. My blood ran cold. "We want you to understand," they said, picking up a syringe and inspecting it as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "Your parents, they're part of something much larger than you could ever comprehend. And now, so are you." I struggled to process their words, my mind spinning. "I don't want any part of this," I said, my voice trembling. "Just let me go." They smiled, a thin, humorless smile that sent chills down my spine. "It's too late for that. You've seen too much, asked too many questions. The only way out now is through." "What does that mean?" I demanded, desperation creeping into my voice. They didn't answer right away. Instead, they turned back to the table, setting down the syringe and picking up something else. A small, sleek device that looked like a remote control. They pressed a button, and suddenly, the wall behind them lit up, revealing a large monitor. The screen flickered to life, showing a series of images. At first, they were just blurry shapes, but as they came into focus, I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. They were photos of people, men, women, even children, taken in their homes, on the streets, in everyday settings, but there was something horribly wrong with them. Their faces were twisted in fear, their eyes wide with terror, as if they knew what was coming next. "These are our targets," the person said, their voice devoid of emotion. Each one of them, a threat, an anomaly that needed to be neutralized. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the screen, horrified by what I was seeing. I recognized some of the locations from the journal I'd found in my parents' closet. These were the people they had been tracking, the ones they had dealt with. But why? What made them targets? "What did they do?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Some were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time," they said, as if that explained everything. "Others, well, they knew too much, just like you." My heart was pounding in my chest, the realization hitting me like a freight train. This wasn't just about my parents. This was about something much larger, something that spanned far beyond them, a network, an organization that decided who lived and who died based on criteria that made no sense to me. "What do you want from me?" I asked again, my voice shaking. They turned to face me, their eyes cold and unfeeling. We want you to understand, to see the bigger picture. Your parents, they were chosen, just like you've been chosen. This is your life now. You can either accept it, or they trailed off. But I knew what they were implying. The alternative wasn't something I wanted to think about. What if I refuse? I asked, even though I already knew the answer. Their expression didn't change. Then you'll become a target, just like the rest. And trust me, it won't be quick, and it won't be painless. I felt a surge of defiance, a flicker of resistance. I'll never be like you, I spat. I'll never do what you do. They just smiled, that cold, humorless smile again. We all said that at first. But the black room has a way of changing minds. You'll see. The door behind them suddenly swung open, and two more figures stepped into the room. They were dressed in the same black attire, their faces obscured by masks. Without a word, they moved toward me, grabbing my arms and hauling me to my feet. I tried to resist, but I was still weak from the drug, my movements sluggish and uncoordinated. As they dragged me toward the door, the person who had been talking to me followed, their footsteps echoing in the sterile room. "Welcome to the black room," they said, their voice a chilling whisper. "It's time to begin your training." I struggled against the grips of the two masked figures, my mind screaming in protest, but it was no use. They were too strong, and I was too weak. As they pulled me through the doorway and into the dimly lit hallway beyond, I caught one last glimpse of the room, the cold, sterile walls, the table covered with instruments, the screen still showing those horrifying images, and then the door slammed shut behind me, plunging me into darkness. That was the last time I saw the world as it was before, the last time I was truly myself. They took me into the depths of the black room, into a place where time and reality twisted, where my mind was broken and remade. The things I learned there, the things I did, I can't even describe them. I don't want to, but now I understand. I understand everything. I'm part of the organization now, just like my parents were. I go where they tell me, do what they command. I'm one of the travelers, moving from city to city, dealing with the targets they assign. It's my life now, and there's no escaping it. I've seen too much, done too much, to ever go back. The black room made sure of that. And the worst part is, sometimes late at night, I catch myself smiling, that cold, humorless smile, just like they did. I ordered sand from Mars on the deep web. I now know why my luck isn't on purpose. Hey, Reddit, I've been lurking here for a while, reading all your stories, and never really thought I'd have one of my own to share. But something happened to me recently that I can't keep to myself anymore. I don't know if you'll believe me, but I need to get this off my chest. Maybe writing it all down will help me make sense of it, or at least help me sleep at night. So here goes. It all started a few weeks ago when I was browsing the deep web. I know, I'm an idiot for even going there. But I've always had this fascination with the weird and unusual, the stuff you can't find on the regular internet. I wasn't looking for anything in particular, just browsing through some shady forums and marketplaces out of curiosity. I stumbled across a listing that caught my eye. Martian sand, genuine sample from Mars. The title was bold, almost screaming at me from the screen. It seemed ridiculous, obviously a scam, but something about it intrigued me. Maybe it was the picture they used, a small glass vial filled with reddish sand, glowing faintly under the light. Or maybe it was the description that claimed this sand was not like anything found on Earth. and had unique properties. The listing was from a user named Curiosity Shop 23, which I thought was a clever nod to the Mars rover. The price was steep, $500 for a tiny vial of sand, but the idea of owning something that supposedly came from Mars was too tempting to pass up. I figured at worst, I'd just be out a few $100 and have a cool story to tell my friends. I transferred the Bitcoin, which felt as shady as you'd expect, and waited for the seller to confirm the order. The confirmation came almost immediately, but with an unexpected twist. Instead of the usual "thank you for your purchase," the message read, "Consider this a warning. Handle with care. Your luck isn't on purpose." I reread that message a dozen times, trying to figure out what the hell it meant. Was it a joke? Some kind of marketing gimmick? I even Googled the phrase, "Your luck isn't on purpose," but nothing came up. It was just strange. A week passed, and I almost forgot about the whole thing until a small, unmarked package arrived at my door. It was so nondescript that I almost threw it out with the junk mail, but when I picked it up, I felt a weight to it, much heavier than I expected for such a small box. Inside, wrapped in layers of bubble wrap, was the vial. It looked exactly like the picture, a small glass container filled with reddish sand, just like the stuff you see in pictures of Mars. There was no note, no instructions, nothing to identify where it came from, just the vial, sitting there in my hand, almost daring me to open it. Now, I'm not superstitious, but I did feel a weird sense of unease as I held it. That warning message kept playing in my head, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was messing with something I didn't understand. But curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to open it. The moment I popped the cork, a faint metallic smell filled the room, like hot iron or blood. It wasn't overpowering, but it was definitely noticeable. I tipped the vial slightly, and a few grains of sand spilled onto the table. They shimmered in the light, almost like they were alive. I don't know how to describe it, like the sand was shifting, even though there was no wind or movement in the room. I stared at it for a long time, feeling a strange pull to touch it. I finally gave in and pressed my finger into the tiny pile. The sand was cool to the touch, but the moment I made contact, I felt a sharp, burning sensation, like I'd been pricked by a needle. I jerked my hand back, but when I looked at my finger, there was no mark, no blood, nothing to show that anything had happened. That's when the bad luck started. At first, it was just little things. My phone screen cracked, even though I hadn't dropped it. My car wouldn't start, even though it had never given me trouble before. My bank account showed a charge I didn't recognize, and when I tried to dispute it, the bank claimed it was legit. But then things escalated. Fast. I began losing things. My wallet, my keys, important documents, all disappearing without a trace. My apartment started feeling off, like I wasn't alone. I'd catch glimpses of shadows moving out of the corner of my eye, but when I turned to look, nothing was there. And the sand, I could swear the vial was getting emptier. I'd only spilled a few grains, but now it looked like half the sand was gone. I thought I was losing my mind, that maybe I'd spilled more than I realized. But no matter how carefully I checked the vial, more sand seemed to disappear every day. I don't know what I've brought into my life, but whatever it is, I don't think it's from Mars. At least not the Mars we've been told about. Something is wrong, and I have this terrible feeling that it's only just beginning. I'm not sure what to do. I can't throw the sand away. Believe me, I've tried. Every time I try to get rid of it, the vial reappears somewhere in my apartment. And the more I try to ignore it, the worse the bad luck gets. Part of me thinks I should have heeded that warning. Your luck isn't on purpose. But now it's too late. Whatever this is, it's latched onto me, and I don't know how to stop it. I'll keep you all updated if anything else happens. But honestly, I'm starting to think I might not have much time left. If anyone has any ideas, anything at all, I'm all ears. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I know how paranoid that sounds, but ever since that vial arrived, it's like I'm being stalked by something just out of sight. The shadows in my apartment have taken on a life of their own, twisting and shifting, even when the lights are on. I've started sleeping with the lights on, which isn't doing much good since I'm barely sleeping at all. It's the dreams that are the worst. They started the night after I opened the vial. At first, they were just vague, unsettling visions, endless deserts stretching out under a blood-red sky, the air thick with a suffocating heat. I'd be wandering through the sand, feeling like something was just beneath the surface, waiting to pull me under. But last night, the dream was different, more vivid, more real. I was standing on the edge of a massive crater, the ground beneath me cracked and dry, like an ancient wound. At the bottom of the crater, something was moving, something huge. It was buried in the sand, only glimpses of it visible as it shifted and writhed, like it was trying to break free. I felt an overwhelming sense of dread, like I was staring into the heart of something I wasn't supposed to see. I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding in my chest. But the worst part? When I got out of bed, I found sand on the floor. Not just a few grains, but a small pile right next to where I'd been sleeping. I have no idea how it got there. I hadn't opened the vial since that first time, and I sure as hell didn't bring it into my bedroom. But there it was, the same reddish sand, now sprinkled across my floor, like it had seeped through the cracks in reality. I tried to clean it up, but no matter how much I swept, more sand kept appearing. It's like it's spreading, slowly but surely, inching its way into every part of my life. I found it in my shoes, in my clothes, even in my food. I can't escape it, no matter what I do. And it's not just the sand. Weird things keep happening, things I can't explain. My lights flicker constantly, even though I've had the wiring checked twice. My electronics glitch out at the worst possible moments. My laptop screen froze while I was writing this, and my phone randomly shuts off whenever I try to call for help. The shadows, though, they're getting bolder. I've seen them move, I swear it, not just out of the corner of my eye anymore, but right in front of me. They stretch and grow, reaching out like they're trying to touch me. And the feeling of being watched has intensified. It's like there's something in the room with me, something I can't see but know is there, waiting for the right moment to strike. A few days ago, I tried to contact the seller, Curiosity Shop 23, to demand some kind of explanation, but when I logged back onto the deep web marketplace, the account was gone, completely wiped, like it never existed, and the message history erased. It's like someone didn't want me to find out more. Or worse, they didn't want anyone else to know what's happening to me. I even went to a friend of mine who's into all that paranormal stuff, thinking maybe he could help. He's the kind of guy who collects haunted objects and swears by the existence of ghosts and spirits. But when I showed him the vial, he went pale and told me to get out of his house. He said he didn't want to get involved, that whatever I had wasn't natural. He wouldn't even look at me as I left, just muttering something about how I'd brought the other side too close. That freaked me out more than anything. This is a guy who's usually all about that creepy, supernatural stuff, and even he wanted nothing to do with it. I don't know what to do anymore. The bad luck is turning into something worse, something like a curse. And the sand, it's not just spreading. I think it's calling to something. Whatever was in that dream, whatever was in that crater, I think it's real. And I think it's coming for me. I don't know how much longer I can take this. The sense of dread is growing, like a weight on my chest that I can't get rid of. Every night, the dreams get worse, and every morning, there's more sand. It's like I'm being pulled into that desert, inch by inch, grain by grain. I can't keep this to myself anymore. I need help, but I don't even know where to start. If anyone out there knows anything about this kind of thing, curses, ancient artifacts, whatever, please, I'm begging you, tell me what to do. Because I'm starting to think that the sand isn't just from Mars. I think it's a doorway. And I think something on the other side is trying to come through. The walls of my apartment have become a canvas for the unknown. Dark, sprawling patterns have started to emerge, resembling cracks, but with an unnatural symmetry, almost like veins spreading out in all directions. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me, a side effect of the sleepless nights and constant anxiety. But as the days go by, these markings become more pronounced, more real. Last night something happened that shook me to my core. I was sitting in my living room, every light in the apartment blazing, trying to drown out the shadows that seemed to dance just beyond the glow. The vial of sand sat on the coffee table, mocking me with its silent presence. Half empty now, or was it half full? Either way, the sand level continued to diminish, and I had no explanation for where it was going. Determined to put an end to this nightmare, I decided to destroy the vial. Maybe, just maybe, breaking it would sever whatever connection had been established. I grabbed a hammer from my toolbox and positioned the vial on the floor, covering it with a thick towel to prevent shards from flying everywhere. Taking a deep breath, I raised the hammer and brought it down with all my might. The impact resonated through the room, a sharp, piercing sound that seemed to linger longer than it should have. I lifted the towel, expecting to see shattered glass and sand scattered across the floor. But the vial was untouched. Not a scratch, not a crack, nothing. It sat there, pristine and mocking, as if defying the very laws of physics. My hands trembled as I picked it up, the glass cool against my skin. A cold sweat broke out on my forehead. This was impossible. Desperation took over. I tried everything. Fire, acid, even attempting to grind it down with a power tool. Each time, the vial remained unscathed, impervious to any damage I tried to inflict. It was as if it existed outside the realm of our reality, immune to any force I could muster. Defeated, I collapsed onto the couch, the weight of my actions pressing down on me. That's when I heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the windows were closed. The whisper grew louder, more distinct, a chorus of voices overlapping, speaking in a language I couldn't comprehend. I strained to make out any words, but it was futile. The voices seemed to emanate from the very walls, the air vibrating with their intensity. Then amidst the cacophony, a single phrase emerged, clear and haunting. He comes when the sands fall. A chill ran down my spine. I looked at the vial, noticing that more sand had disappeared. Now barely a quarter of it remained. The realization hit me like a freight train. The sand was a timer, counting down to something or someone. Panic surged through me. I needed answers, and fast. Remembering the cryptic message from the cellar, "Your luck isn't on purpose," I wondered if there was more to it than I initially thought. Maybe it was a clue. I dived back into the depths of the internet, searching forums, obscure websites, anything that could shed light on my predicament. Hours blurred as I sifted through pages of information, most of it useless. But then, buried deep within a thread discussing ancient artifacts, I found a mention of a legend. An old tale spoke of a substance called the Summoner's Sand, said to be a conduit between worlds. When released, it acted as a beacon, drawing forth entities from realms beyond our understanding. The legends warned that those who possessed the sand were marked, destined to be hosts for beings that hungered for a foothold in our world. My heart raced as I connected the dots. The sand, the whispers, the shadows, all signs pointing to an impending invasion. And I had been the fool to open the door. Determined not to be a passive victim, I sought out anyone who might help. My previous encounter with my paranormal friend had been a dead end, but perhaps there were others less afraid. I remembered an old bookstore downtown, elder pages, rumored to house texts on the occult and forbidden knowledge. The owner, Mr. Graves, was an eccentric old man, known for his vast collection of rare books and an openness to the strange. I visited the store at dawn, the city still asleep, a fog hanging low in the streets. The bell above the door chimed softly as I entered, the scent of aged paper and ink filling my nostrils. Shelves towered above me, filled with tomes of every size and color. Mr. Graves emerged from behind a shelf, his piercing gray eyes studying me intently. Before I could speak, he said, "I've been expecting you." Taken aback, I stammered, You have?" He nodded slowly. "The shadows whispered of your coming. You carry the mark." I felt a lump in my throat. "Can you help me?" He gestured for me to follow, leading me to a back room cluttered with artifacts and scrolls. He motioned for me to sit, his gaze never leaving me. "You've meddled with forces beyond comprehension," he began. "The sand you possess is not of this world, nor is it from the barren lands of Mars, as you believe. It originates from the void, a realm between realities. By releasing it, you've signaled to the inhabitants of that realm a summons." My mind reeled. How do I stop it? How do I send them back? Mr. Graves sighed, the weight of centuries in his exhale. "Once the sands fall, the gate opens, but all is not lost. There exists a ritual, ancient and perilous, to sever the bond and close the gateway." He handed me a dusty, leather-bound book, its pages yellowed with age. "Within these pages lies the ritual. But be warned, the price of tampering with such forces is steep. Are you prepared to pay it?" I nodded, determination overshadowing fear. "I'll do whatever it takes." As I left Elder Pages, the book clutched tightly in my hands. A sense of purpose filled me. The path ahead was treacherous, but if there was a chance to undo the horror I had unleashed, I had to take it. The sands continued to fall, and with each grain, the boundary between our world and the void grew thinner. Time was running out. Back in my apartment, the atmosphere felt heavier than ever, as if the very air was thickening around me. The shadows had grown darker, more defined, almost like they were solidifying into something tangible. Every creak, every whisper of wind outside made me jump, my nerves frayed to the point of breaking. The vial sat on the table, nearly empty now. Only a few grains of sand remained, clinging to the bottom like they were reluctant to leave. I knew that once the last grain fell, whatever I had summoned would fully manifest. And if that happened, I wasn't sure there would be any coming back from it. I flipped open the book Mr. Graves had given me, the pages crackling under my fingertips. The language was archaic, but thankfully there were translations scribbled in the margins. The ritual was detailed, precise, and filled with warnings about the dangers of getting anything wrong. The first step was to create a protective circle. According to the book, it wasn't just any ordinary circle, but one infused with symbols and sigils that acted as barriers against the entities from the void. I cleared a space in my living room, pushing furniture aside until I had enough room to draw the intricate design. Using chalk, I carefully sketched out the circle, copying the symbols exactly as they were in the book. My hands shook as I worked, but I forced myself to stay steady. One mistake, and the circle would be useless. As I drew, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, closer than ever. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, but I didn't dare turn around. I knew that if I looked, I'd see something I wasn't ready to face. Once the circle was complete, I placed the vial of sand at the center. The book instructed that the remaining sand was the key to sealing the gateway. I would need to perform a chant, pouring the sand into the circle as I recited the words. The sand would act as a binding agent, closing the portal and trapping the entity on the other side. But there was a catch. The ritual required a sacrifice, not of blood, but of something intangible. The book was vague, only mentioning that the sacrifice had to be of great personal value. It didn't specify what that meant, but I had a sinking feeling that it wouldn't be something I could simply choose to give up. Taking a deep breath, I lit the candles around the circle, their flames flickering weakly against the encroaching darkness. The shadows seemed to recoil from the light, but I knew it was only temporary. I had to act quickly. With the book open beside me, I began to chant the words. The language was harsh, guttural, scraping against my throat as I spoke. As I chanted, I lifted the vial and tilted it, letting the sand pour out slowly. The moment the first grain hit the circle, the temperature in the room plummeted. My breath came out in visible puffs, and the shadows around me started to writhe, like they were alive, responding to the ritual. The room filled with a low humming sound, almost like a deep, resonant growl reverberating from the walls. As the sand fell, I felt a tugging sensation deep within me, something pulling at my mind, my very soul. It was as if the ritual was reaching inside me, searching for whatever it was I had to give up. The book's words about the sacrifice echoed in my head, but I kept chanting, forcing myself to continue. The sand was nearly gone, just a few grains left, when I felt it, an overwhelming sense of loss. It hit me like a punch to the gut, and I faltered, the chant breaking off as I gasped for air. In that moment, I knew what the sacrifice was. The ritual wasn't just asking for something I valued. It was taking something essential, something that defined me. My memories, flashes of my past, began to fade, slipping away like sand through my fingers. My childhood, the faces of friends and family, moments that had shaped who I was, they all started to blur, dissolving into nothingness. I could feel them being pulled from me, consumed by the ritual as payment for the closing of the portal. I wanted to stop, to abandon the ritual and keep what little of myself I had left, but the entity was too close now. The shadows had started to converge on the circle, a black mass that seemed to pulse with malevolent intent. If I didn't finish the ritual, if I didn't close the gateway, whatever was on the other side would break through, and I would lose more than just memories. I'd lose everything. Forcing myself to continue, I resumed the chant, my voice shaky and weak. The last grains of sand fell into the circle, and the pull inside me intensified. The room seemed to vibrate with a dark energy, the walls closing in, the shadows reaching out like claws. Then with a final word, the last grain of sand hit the floor. The effect was immediate. The shadows recoiled violently, like they'd been struck, and a deafening roar filled the room, shaking the very foundations of the apartment. The circle glowed brightly for a brief moment, before everything went dark. Silence. I don't know how long I lay there, but when I finally opened my eyes, the room was still. The shadows were gone, retreating back into the corners where they belonged. The air felt lighter, the oppressive weight lifted. The vial was empty, the sand completely gone. The circle too had faded, leaving no trace of the ritual behind. But I could feel the emptiness inside me, the memories that had been taken, the parts of me that were now lost forever. I knew I had stopped the entity, sealed the gateway, but at a cost I wasn't sure I could bear. I was safe, but I wasn't whole. As I sat there in the dim light of the candles, I realized something terrifying. The book had mentioned the sacrifice as a necessary part of the ritual, but it hadn't said anything about what would happen afterward. And that's when I heard it, a faint whisper, barely audible, but unmistakable. He's still coming. I was wrong. The ritual hadn't stopped him. It had only delayed the inevitable. In the days that followed the ritual, I tried to convince myself that the worst was over, that maybe the whisper I'd heard was just my mind playing tricks on me, a side effect of the trauma. But deep down, I knew better. The shadows in my apartment were gone. The oppressive weight lifted, but the sense of unease remained, like a splinter lodged in my psyche. Something was still wrong, very wrong. My memories were scattered, fragments of my life missing, leaving empty spaces where there should have been warmth and familiarity. Faces I should have recognized were now strangers, and certain places felt distant, as if I had never been there at all. But beyond that, there was something else, a gnawing sensation that something or someone was still watching me, biding its time. I stopped sleeping, or maybe I just couldn't anymore. Whenever I closed my eyes, I'd see that endless desert, the crater, and the thing writhing beneath the sand. The ritual might have slowed its approach, but it hadn't stopped it. The entity, whatever it was still coming, and I was running out of time. Desperation drove me to Elder Page's again, but when I arrived, the store was gone. The windows were boarded up, a for lease sign hanging crookedly on the door. I asked around, but no one seemed to remember the store or Mr. Graves. It was as if the entire place had vanished overnight, erased from existence just like my memories. I returned to my apartment, feeling more isolated than ever. I had no one left to turn to, and I knew I couldn't stay here much longer. The air was thick with a familiar tension, the kind that prickles your skin and sends chills down your spine. The apartment was no longer a refuge. It was a trap, waiting to spring. And then, one night, the sand returned. I was sitting in the dark, the remnants of a cold dinner untouched on the table, when I noticed it, a single grain of sand on the floor. My heart skipped a beat. I hadn't seen any sand since the ritual, and I'd foolishly hoped that was the end of it. But there it was, unmistakable against the hardwood. As I stared at it, more grains began to appear, one by one, materializing out of thin air. They gathered in a small pile, right where the vial had sat during the ritual. The message was clear. The sand wasn't finished with me. Or maybe I wasn't finished with it. My hands shook as I reached for the book Mr. Graves had given me, the only thing I had left that connected me to the truth. I scoured its pages for something I might have missed, some small detail that could explain what was happening. But there was nothing, no mention of what to do if the sand returned, no guidance on how to stop the entity if the ritual failed. The last page, however, had something I hadn't noticed before. It was a symbol, one I hadn't used in the initial ritual, with a brief note in the margins. When all else fails, use this. But be warned, the cost is irreversible. I didn't know what the cost was, but at that moment, I didn't care. The sand was gathering faster now, the pile growing by the minute. I could feel the entity's presence stronger than ever, the air thickening with its approach. I had no choice. I cleared a space on the floor, hastily drawing the symbol from the book, my hands smudging the chalk as I worked. The symbol was complex, with intertwining lines and jagged edges that seemed to pulse as I completed them. It didn't look like the other symbols. This one felt darker, more final. With the symbol finished, I stood in the center and began the chant, my voice trembling but steady. The room darkened around me, the light from the candles flickering wildly, as if fighting against the growing darkness. The sand was now pouring in from nowhere, a relentless stream that circled the symbol, trapping me within its bounds. The pull inside me returned, stronger than before, and this time it wasn't just my memories at stake. I felt my very essence being tugged at, like the ritual was trying to tear me apart from the inside. I pushed through the pain, continuing the chant, knowing that stopping now would be the end of everything. The room shuddered, a deep rumble vibrating through the walls, the floor, my bones. The sand began to glow, a deep crimson light that filled the space with an unnatural radiance. The symbol beneath me started to burn, the lines searing into the floor as if etched by fire. And then I felt it, the entity. It was no longer just a presence, no longer just a shadow in my mind. It was here, in the room with me, towering above, a mass of darkness and void, barely held back by the thin barrier of the symbol. I could feel its hunger, its rage, its desire to break free and consume everything in its path. With a final, desperate cry, I uttered the last words of the chant. The symbol flared brightly, the light blinding me, and then there was an explosion of sound and energy, as if the very fabric of reality had been torn apart. When the light faded and the sound died down, I found myself on the floor, the apartment eerily silent. The sand was gone. Every grain vanished without a trace. The symbol was burnt into the floor, a permanent scar that I knew would never fade. The air felt different, lighter, clearer, as if a great weight had been lifted. But the cost, I felt it immediately. The emptiness inside me was vast, a gaping hole where something vital had once been. I couldn't remember what it was, but I knew it was gone forever, taken as payment for the final banishment of the entity. I got up slowly, unsteady on my feet. The apartment was still, the shadows no longer threatening, the sense of being watched finally gone. I had won in a way, but the victory felt hollow. In the days that followed, I tried to return to some semblance of normalcy, but it was impossible. I was a shell of who I once was, haunted by the knowledge of what I had lost and the lingering fear that something might still be out there, waiting for another chance. I moved out of the apartment, leaving behind everything but the book. I couldn't bear to stay in a place that held so many terrible memories, and I couldn't risk anyone else finding it. I keep the book hidden now, locked away where no one can stumble upon it by accident. But every now and then, I hear a whisper in the dark, a faint echo of the voices that had tormented me. And in those moments, I can't help but wonder if the entity is truly gone, or if it's still out there, waiting for the last grain of sand to fall. And when it does, I know I won't be the only one who has to pay the price. I ordered a brother of the deep web. I think he is something more than human. I never thought I'd be the kind of person to admit that I ordered a brother off the deep web. Honestly, it started as a stupid joke between my friends and me. We were hanging out in my basement, bored out of our minds, talking about the weirdest stuff we could find online. You know, the kind of weird that makes you question the sanity of the human race. We'd gone down the rabbit hole of weird subreddits, conspiracy theories, and then of course, the infamous deep web. I'd heard all the stories, hitmen for hire, human trafficking, and the most twisted, depraved stuff imaginable. But my friends and I were drawn to it like moths to a flame, partly out of curiosity, and partly because, let's face it, we were just bored. It was around 2 a.m. when Danny, my best friend since middle school, found this bizarre forum thread. The title was in all caps, "Build Your Own Family, Deep Web Exclusive." It was the kind of clickbait that usually led to nothing but scams or viruses. But Danny, being the reckless idiot he is, decided to click on it. The site was just as sketchy as you'd expect. The design was straight out of the 90s, with blinking text and pixelated images. But what caught our attention were the options listed on the page: build a brother, customize a sister, create the perfect parent. It was like some twisted black market version of The Sims. Each family member came with a detailed description, almost like a catalog for adopting pets, but infinitely more disturbing. The prices were insane. Thousands of dollars for what was basically a human being, but the descriptions made them sound like they were custom made. Each brother or sister had a list of personality traits, skills, and, creepily enough, preferences. Some were geniuses, some were athletes, and some were, well, there were some that sounded too good to be true. At first, we were all laughing it off. I mean, the whole thing seemed like a sick joke, or maybe some elaborate ARG. But then Danny dared me to do it, to actually buy one. Come on, man. Think about it. How sick would it be to have a brother who's like a super soldier or something, he said, egging me on with that mischievous grin of his. The thing is, I'm not the kind of guy who usually backs down from a dare, especially when there's money involved. And let's just say Danny and the others were more than willing to chip in to see if this whole thing was real. So, half joking, half serious, I clicked on the Build a Brother option and started filling out the form. The choices were weird, like something out of a dystopian novel. Eye color, hair color, height, weight, all the usual stuff. But then it got really specific, asking about things like preferred hobbies and moral flexibility. What the hell did that even mean? There were also boxes for special abilities and physical enhancements, but those options were locked unless you paid extra. I wasn't trying to break the bank, so I stuck with the basics. When I got to the payment screen, it felt like a point of no return. My friends were all hyped up, practically yelling at me to go through with it. So, with my heart pounding in my chest, I entered my credit card info and hit confirm. The screen blinked, and for a moment, I thought maybe I'd just been scammed out of a couple $100. But then a message popped up. Thank you for your purchase. Your brother will arrive in 7 business days. We all sat there in stunned silence. The reality of what I had just done was starting to sink in, but we were still laughing it off, convinced that it was some elaborate prank site that would send me a life-size cardboard cutout or something. The night ended with us making more dumb bets on what would actually show up, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had done something really, really stupid. Over the next few days, life went back to normal, but there was this constant nagging anxiety in the back of my mind. What if something actually showed up? I told myself that it was just a scam and nothing would come of it. But every time I heard a knock at the door, my heart would race a little faster. And then on the 6th day, the doorbell rang. When I opened the door, there was a large unmarked box sitting on my front porch. No delivery truck in sight, no receipt, nothing. Just a plain brown box that looked way too big for what I was expecting. It was heavy, too. Heavier than anything I'd ever lifted. I dragged it inside, my stomach twisting with a mixture of excitement and dread. My friends weren't around this time, so I was alone when I tore open the box. Inside, there was a man. He was curled up in a fetal position, eyes closed, like he was sleeping. He looked normal. Too normal, actually. His skin was pale, his hair dark and messy, but he was wearing clothes, like someone had dressed him before shipping him off. For a moment, I just stood there, frozen, not sure what the hell I was supposed to do. Then his eyes opened. They were dark, almost black, and they locked onto mine with an intensity that sent chills down my spine. He slowly uncurled himself, standing up in one fluid motion, and I realized just how tall he was, easily over 6 feet, and built like he could crush me with one hand. "Hello, brother," he said, his voice calm and even, like we were just meeting up for lunch or something. I didn't know what to say. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. This wasn't some elaborate prank. This was real. Too real. And that's when I started to realize that maybe, just maybe, I'd made a huge mistake. For a few seconds, we just stood there, staring at each other. I couldn't move, couldn't think. It was like my brain was short-circuiting, trying to process the impossible reality in front of me. This guy, this brother, was way too real. I half expected him to glitch out or start reciting some pre-programmed lines like a robot, but he didn't. He just kept staring at me with those dark, unnerving eyes. Hi? I finally managed to stammer, my voice barely above a whisper. "Do you know who I am?" He nodded slowly, his gaze never wavering. "Yes, you're my brother." The way he said it sent shivers down my spine. There was something off about his voice. Too calm, too controlled. It wasn't robotic, but it was detached, like he was reading from a script that only he could see. I couldn't put my finger on it, but something about him just didn't feel right. Right. "Okay," I mumbled, trying to keep my voice steady. "So, do you have a name?" He tilted his head slightly, as if considering the question. "I don't have a name. You can call me whatever you like." That didn't help ease the growing pit of anxiety in my stomach. I didn't know what to do next. Do I ask him to leave? offer him a drink, call the cops. My thoughts were all over the place, and it didn't help that he was just standing there, watching me with that unsettling intensity. "All right, let's go to the living room," I said, trying to regain some control of the situation. I figured it'd be easier to think if we weren't standing in the middle of my hallway, with him looming over me like a silent giant. He followed me without a word, his footsteps eerily silent despite his size. When we got to the living room, I motioned for him to sit on the couch. He did, moving with that same unnerving fluidity, like he was too in control of his body. I sat down across from him, trying to make sense of what was happening. "Listen, I wasn't really expecting this," I began, struggling to find the right words. "I mean, I don't even know how this is possible. Are you, like, a real person?" His expression didn't change. "I'm as real as you want me to be." That wasn't an answer, at least not one that made any sense. My head was spinning with questions, but every time I looked at him, I felt like I was staring into a void, like there was something missing behind his eyes, something that made him less than human. "Do you remember anything?" I asked, trying to keep the conversation going. "Like, where you came from, or how you got here?" He shook his head slowly. "I only remember waking up here. You're my brother. That's all I know." This was getting more and more bizarre. He wasn't acting like someone who'd just been kidnapped or brainwashed or whatever. He seemed completely at ease, like being shipped in a box and waking up in a stranger's house was totally normal. It was like he was made for this, designed to be exactly what I'd ordered. But then it hit me. This wasn't normal. Nothing about this was normal. I had literally ordered a person off the deep web, and now he was sitting in my living room, acting like we were just long-lost siblings catching up. The absurdity of the situation was overwhelming, but there was something else gnawing at the back of my mind, something I didn't want to admit to myself. I was scared of him. There was no reason to be, at least not on the surface. He hadn't done anything threatening or violent, but the way he moved, the way he talked, it was all too controlled, too perfect, like he was playing a part, but I had no idea what the script was. And those eyes, they were dark, sure, but there was something in them that made my skin crawl, something I couldn't quite place, but it felt wrong, like looking into a mirror that didn't reflect you properly. "Look, man, I think there's been a mistake," I said, trying to sound as calm as possible. "Maybe you should go. I can help you find your way back or something, but you can't stay here." He didn't react right away. For a moment, I thought he hadn't heard me, but then he stood up, towering over me. His expression remained neutral, but there was something in his posture that made my heart race. It was like he was sizing me up, deciding whether to listen to me or not. "You don't want me here?" he asked, his voice still that same unnerving calm. It was a simple question, but the way he asked it sent a chill down my spine. There was no anger in his voice, no hurt, just a flat, emotionless tone that made me feel like I was talking to a stranger, not someone who was supposed to be my brother. "No, it's not that," I lied, forcing a nervous smile. "It's just, I wasn't expecting this, you know? I think you'd be better off somewhere else." He stared at me for a long moment, and I could feel my palms starting to sweat. And just as suddenly as he stood up, he nodded and walked towards the door. Relief washed over me, but it was quickly replaced by confusion as he paused at the doorway. "I'll go, but I'll be back," he said, turning to look at me one last time. "You can't get rid of me that easily." And with that, he walked out, closing the door behind him. I didn't move for a solid 5 minutes after he left. My mind was reeling, trying to process everything that had just happened. What the hell had I just unleashed? Was this some kind of sick joke, or was there something more sinister going on? I rushed to the front window, peering outside, but there was no sign of him. No footsteps, no shadow, nothing. It was like he'd vanished into thin air. My stomach churned with unease, and a creeping dread began to settle in the pit of my stomach. Maybe I'd gotten lucky, and he'd just leave me alone. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. He'd said he'd be back, and I believed him. And that's what terrified me the most. The hours after he left felt like an eternity. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, even though I was alone in my house. I tried to distract myself, played some video games, scrolled through social media, anything to get my mind off what had just happened, but nothing worked. My thoughts kept drifting back to him, to the way he'd looked at me, and that flat, emotionless voice telling me he'd be back. I thought about calling Danny or one of the guys, but what would I even say? Hey, remember that brother I ordered off the deep web? Yeah, turns out he's real. And I think he might be stalking me now. They'd think I was losing it. Or worse, they'd just laugh it off like we always do. And honestly, I wasn't sure how much of this was real myself. Maybe I was just tired, my mind playing tricks on me after all the weirdness. But the feeling of unease wouldn't go away. Every creak of the house, every distant sound outside made me jump. I double-checked the locks on all the doors and windows, even though I knew it wouldn't make much difference if he decided to come back. He didn't feel like someone who could be stopped by a deadbolt. I finally gave up on trying to distract myself and headed to bed, though I knew sleep was a long shot. The darkness of my room seemed thicker, more oppressive than usual, like it was pressing in on me from all sides. I kept the lamp on, its dim light barely cutting through the shadows. My mind kept replaying the last thing he'd said. You can't get rid of me that easily. I must have dozed off at some point, because the next thing I remember was waking up to a soft tapping sound. My heart skipped a beat, and for a second, I was too scared to open my eyes, afraid of what I might see. The tapping was rhythmic, almost deliberate, like someone was trying to get my attention without waking me up completely. Finally, I forced myself to look. The room was just as I'd left it, the lamp casting long shadows across the walls, but the sound wasn't coming from inside. It was coming from the window. I slowly turned my head, my breath catching in my throat. The curtains were drawn, but I could see the faint outline of a figure standing just outside. The tapping continued, soft but persistent, as if he was waiting for me to acknowledge him. My body went rigid with fear. He was back. I lay there paralyzed, trying to convince myself that it was just a trick of the light, or maybe a tree branch brushing against the window. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. He'd found me again, just like he said he would. After what felt like an eternity, the tapping stopped. The silence that followed was almost worse, like the calm before a storm. I strained to hear any other sounds, but there was nothing. No footsteps, no movement, just an oppressive stillness that made my skin crawl. I didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe too loudly. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I was terrified that he could hear it, that he was still out there, just waiting for the right moment. The minutes ticked by. each one stretching out longer than the last, until finally the tension became too much. I had to see if he was still there. Slowly, I sat up, every nerve in my body screaming at me to stay still. I reached for my phone on the nightstand, clutching it like a lifeline. The screen lit up, casting a pale glow across the room, and I opened the camera, flipping it to the front-facing lens. I pointed it towards the window, my hand shaking as I held it up to see what the camera would catch. At first, there was nothing, just the curtains swaying slightly in the breeze from the air vent. But then I noticed it. A shadow, just barely visible through the gap in the curtains, standing motionless outside the window. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt my heart skip a beat. I couldn't make out any details, just the vague outline of a person, but I knew it was him. He was back, and he was watching me. I dropped the phone, the screen going dark as it hit the bed. I couldn't look anymore. I couldn't face the reality of what was happening. Instead, I did the only thing I could think of. I pulled the covers over my head like a scared little kid, hoping that somehow that thin layer of fabric would protect me from whatever was lurking outside. The night dragged on, the silence only broken by the occasional creak of the house settling. I was too terrified to move, too scared to even peek out from under the blankets. I kept telling myself that if I just stayed hidden, he'd go away. But deep down, I knew that was a lie. He wasn't going anywhere. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I must have fallen asleep out of the sheer mental and physical fatigue. When I woke up, it was morning. Sunlight streamed in through the window, and for a brief, blissful moment, I almost convinced myself that it had all been a nightmare. But when I looked at my phone, the camera was still open, frozen on that last frame. The shadow was still there, barely visible, but unmistakable. I felt a cold dread settle over me. I knew what I had to do, but I didn't want to face it. I didn't want to acknowledge that this was real, that I had somehow invited this thing into my life, but I couldn't ignore it any longer. I needed answers. That afternoon, I decided to go back to the deep website where this all started. Maybe there was something I missed, some way to undo what I'd done. But when I tried to access the page, it was gone. 404 error, like it had never existed. Panic started to set in. How was that possible? We'd all seen it. We'd all been there when I placed the order. I searched through my browser history, my emails, anything that could prove it had been real. But there was nothing. It was like the site had vanished into thin air, leaving no trace behind, except for him. I sat there in front of my computer, my mind racing. There was no way out of this. I had no proof, no explanation, nothing to show for what was happening to me. But I knew he was still out there, waiting. And if he could find me once, he could do it again. I couldn't stay in my house any longer. I packed a bag, grabbed my keys, and got the hell out of there. I didn't have a plan, just a desperate need to be anywhere but there. I drove aimlessly for hours, trying to clear my head, trying to figure out what to do next. But no matter how far I drove, that feeling of being watched never left me. I didn't stop driving until I was almost out of gas, miles away from my house, from anyone I knew. The whole time, I kept checking the rear-view mirror, half expecting to see him following me, but there was nothing. Just the empty road and my growing paranoia. I found a cheap motel off the highway, the kind of place where no one asks questions, and checked in under a fake name. The guy at the front desk didn't even look up from his magazine when I handed him cash and took the key. The room was as dingy as you'd expect. Faded wallpaper, a bed that looked like it hadn't been changed in weeks, and a TV that probably hadn't worked since the 90s. But it didn't matter. I just needed a place to hide, somewhere I could catch my breath and figure out what the hell I was going to do next. I locked the door behind me and dragged a chair in front of it, wedging it under the handle. It was a flimsy barrier, but it made me feel a little safer. I didn't bother unpacking. I just collapsed on the bed, trying to think, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. But no matter how hard I tried, I kept coming back to the same terrifying conclusion. I was being hunted. He'd said he'd be back, and I knew he wasn't going to stop until he found me. The thought of those cold, dark eyes watching me from the shadows made my skin crawl. I couldn't stay in one place for long. I had to keep moving, stay one step ahead of him. But how do you run from something you don't even understand? I pulled out my phone, hoping to find some answers online, but every search led to dead ends. The deep website was gone, and any mention of build your own family or anything similar was either a hoax or some urban legend. It was like the whole thing had been erased from existence, leaving me to deal with the aftermath alone. Hours passed, and as night fell, the oppressive silence of the motel room began to weigh on me. I kept the lights off, not wanting to draw any attention, but the darkness only made my anxiety worse. Every little sound, the creak of the floorboards, the hum of the air conditioner, set my nerves on edge. I felt like a caged animal, waiting for the inevitable. Then just as I was starting to doze off, I heard it, a soft scratching sound just outside the door. My heart leapt into my throat. I froze, listening intently, hoping it was just my imagination. But the sound persisted, slow and deliberate, like someone or something was trying to get in. The room was pitch black, but I could make out the faint outline of the door, the chair still wedged under the handle. The scratching stopped for a moment, and then there was a faint rustling, like someone was moving around just outside. I held my breath, my mind racing. There was no way he could have found me. I'd driven for hours, taken every precaution, but deep down, I knew it was him. It had to be. Slowly, I reached for my phone, careful not to make a sound. I turned on the screen, the faint glow illuminating the room just enough for me to see. I didn't dare turn on the flashlight. I didn't want to give away my position, but I needed to be ready to call for help, even though I had no idea who would believe me. The scratching started again, this time louder, more insistent. My pulse quickened, and I could feel the panic rising in my chest. I had to do something, but what? There was no way out. The only window was too small to crawl through, and the door was the only exit. I was trapped. Then just as suddenly as it had started, the scratching stopped. I waited, every muscle in my body tense, expecting the door to burst open at any moment. But instead, there was nothing. Just the deafening silence of the night. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. I just stared at the door, waiting for whatever was out there to make its next move. Minutes passed, and still nothing. Maybe he'd given up, or maybe he was just toying with me, waiting for me to let my guard down. Then without warning, my phone buzzed in my hand. The sudden vibration made me jump, and I nearly dropped it. My heart was pounding as I glanced at the screen, expecting some random notification, or maybe a spam call. But what I saw made my blood run cold. A message from an unknown number. No name, no contact info, just a string of numbers that didn't make any sense. And the message itself was short, just 3 words. I'm here now. I stared at the screen, my mind blank with terror. How did he get my number? How did he find me? I'd left everything behind, done everything I could to stay off the grid, but he'd still found me. The reality of my situation was sinking in, a cold creeping dread that threatened to overwhelm me. Then, as if to confirm my worst fears, the door handle rattled. The chair held, but only just. The door shook as someone, no, as he, tried to force it open. The rattling grew more violent, more desperate, and I could hear his breathing now, heavy and strained, as if he was exerting himself. But the door held. I had to think fast. I couldn't just sit here and wait for him to break in. I grabbed my bag, threw it over my shoulder, and moved as quietly as I could to the window. It was small, too small to escape through, but maybe I could break it, draw attention, anything to get out of this nightmare. But as I reached for the window, I heard something that made my blood turn to ice. His voice. "Brother," he whispered, the word barely audible through the door. "Let me in." It wasn't a demand. It wasn't even a threat. It was just a simple request, spoken with that same unnerving calm that had haunted me since the day he arrived. But there was something else in his voice this time, something darker, more insidious, like he knew he didn't need to force his way in, because eventually I'd open the door myself. I backed away from the window, my mind racing. I couldn't fight him, and I couldn't run, but I wasn't going to give up either. I had to find a way out of this, to get away from him once and for all. The door rattled again, harder this time, and I knew I was running out of time. I looked around the room, desperate for anything I could use as a weapon, but there was nothing. Just the flimsy motel furniture and my own mounting fear. Then I had an idea. It was risky, and I had no idea if it would work, but I was out of options. I grabbed the TV remote from the nightstand and pointed it at the old boxy TV. I didn't even know if the thing still worked, but I had to try something. I turned the volume up as high as it would go, then switched to static. The sudden burst of noise filled the room, a loud grating sound that made my ears ring. The door rattled again, more violently now, but I could hear him hesitate, like the noise had thrown him off. Maybe it wasn't much, but it was a distraction, something to buy me a few precious seconds. I grabbed my phone and did the only thing I could think of. I called the front desk. The phone rang once, twice, and then the gruff voice of the motel clerk answered. "Yeah?" "I need help," I whispered, trying to keep my voice steady. "Someone's trying to break into my room." There was a pause, and I could hear the guy sigh. "Which room?" "Room 12, I said, my voice trembling. "Please, hurry." Another pause, longer this time, and then, "All right, stay put." I didn't know if the clerk was going to be much help, but it was better than nothing. I just needed to hold out a little longer, long enough for someone, anyone, to show up. But as I hung up the phone, I heard it again, his voice, closer this time, right outside the door. "Brother, let me in." I clenched my fists, my mind racing. I couldn't let him get to me. I couldn't let him win. But the door was shaking now, the chair creaking under the pressure. It wouldn't hold much longer. And then, just as I thought the door was going to give way, there was a loud knock. Not at my door. At the door next to mine. Room 13. I froze, listening, as the knock came again, louder this time. The rattling stopped, and I could hear him moving away from my door, his footsteps slow and deliberate. "Brother, let me in," he whispered again. But this time, it wasn't meant for me. It was meant for whoever was in the next room. I didn't wait to find out what happened next. I grabbed my bag and bolted for the window, smashing it open with the chair. The glass shattered, and I climbed through, cutting my hands on the shards, but I didn't care. I was out. I was free. I ran, not stopping to look back, not stopping until I was far away from that motel, from that room, from him. I had no idea where I was going, but anywhere was better than staying there. As I disappeared into the night, his words echoed in my mind, haunting me, driving me forward. Brother, let me in. I didn't stop running until my legs gave out, until I was so far from that motel that it felt like another world entirely. I found myself in a dense patch of woods, the only sound the wind rustling through the trees. My heart was pounding, my breath coming in ragged gasps, but at least I was alone. For now, I collapsed against a tree, trying to catch my breath, trying to think through the haze of fear clouding my mind. How had things spiraled so out of control? What was he? I thought back to that deep website, to the eerie calmness in his voice, and to the way he had found me, no matter where I went. This wasn't just some prank or sick joke. This was something far more sinister, something beyond my understanding, but there was no time to dwell on it. I needed to get away, to disappear. I couldn't go back to my house, couldn't stay in any one place for long. I needed to keep moving, stay off the radar. But where could I go where he wouldn't find me? As I sat there, a horrible realization began to creep into my mind, a thought so terrifying that I'd been pushing it away, refusing to acknowledge it. But now, sitting alone in the dark woods, I couldn't ignore it any longer. What if there was nowhere to hide? I pulled out my phone again, desperate for some kind of clue, some piece of information I'd overlooked. But there was nothing, no messages, no notifications, just the empty black screen staring back at me. And then, in a moment of desperation, I did something I hadn't tried before. I opened the camera app and switched it to the front-facing camera. At first, all I saw was my own terrified face, pale and sweaty, my eyes wide with panic. But then I noticed something behind me, just over my shoulder, barely visible in the darkness. A shadow. I whipped around, my heart racing, but there was nothing there. Just the trees, their branches swaying in the wind. But when I turned back to the camera, the shadow was still there, lurking just out of sight, almost as if it was part of the darkness itself. My hand trembled as I stared at the screen, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The shadow didn't move, didn't shift. It just stayed there, a dark, formless shape that seemed to be watching me. And then, slowly, it began to grow. The realization hit me like a truck. He wasn't following me. He wasn't some physical being that I could outrun or hide from. He was something else, something that was with me wherever I went, no matter how far I ran. He was inside me. I dropped the phone, stumbling to my feet, the world spinning around me. My mind was racing, trying to deny what was becoming increasingly clear. This wasn't just some curse or supernatural entity that had latched onto me. This was something far worse. I had invited him into my life, and now he was a part of me, a part that I couldn't escape, no matter how hard I tried. I was losing control. My thoughts were no longer entirely my own, my actions becoming more erratic, more desperate. I could feel him inside my mind, like a dark presence lurking in the corners, slowly taking over. The fear was overwhelming, but there was also something else, a strange, eerie calmness, like the one in his voice when he'd first spoken to me. Brother. The word echoed in my mind, and I realized with a jolt of horror that it wasn't just his voice anymore. It was mine, my own voice, distorted and twisted, repeating the word over and over again, like a mantra. I staggered through the woods, my thoughts a chaotic swirl of panic and resignation. I had to find a way to stop this, to end it before it consumed me completely. But how? How do you fight something that's a part of you? And then, in the distance, I saw a light, a faint glow, barely visible through the trees. It wasn't much, but it was something, a glimmer of hope in the darkness. I stumbled towards it, driven by some primal instinct, the need to survive overpowering the fear that was threatening to overwhelm me. As I drew closer, I realized the light was coming from a small cabin nestled deep in the woods. It looked abandoned, the windows dark, and the door slightly ajar. But I didn't care. I needed shelter, a place to regroup, to think. I pushed open the door, my breath coming in ragged gasps, and stepped inside. The cabin was empty, just a single room with a dusty bed and a broken chair. The only light came from a small, flickering candle on a table in the corner. I collapsed onto the bed, my body shaking with exhaustion, the weight of what was happening pressing down on me. And then I saw it. In the dim light of the cabin, I caught a glimpse of a mirror hanging on the wall. My reflection stared back at me, pale and gaunt, but there was something wrong. My eyes, they weren't my own. They were dark, almost black, the same unsettling eyes that had haunted me since the day he arrived. I stumbled back, the realization hitting me like a wave. It was too late. He wasn't just inside me. He was becoming me. Or maybe I was becoming him. The thought sent a surge of panic through me, but it was quickly followed by a strange, creeping acceptance. I could feel him now, more clearly than ever before. His presence in my mind, in my body, in my very soul. And with that presence came a terrible understanding. This had been his plan all along. I sank to the floor, my mind unraveling, the last remnants of my will slipping away. The fear was still there, but it was drowned out by the overwhelming sensation of losing myself, of becoming something else, something I couldn't control. Brother, the word escaped my lips unbidden, and I realized with a sinking horror that it wasn't just a word anymore. It was a command, a compulsion. I looked up at the mirror again, and this time I didn't see myself at all. I saw him, his dark eyes staring back at me, a cruel smile playing at the corners of his mouth. And then, as if in a trance, I stood up, the last of my resistance crumbling away. I walked towards the door, towards the dark woods beyond, driven by a force I couldn't understand, couldn't fight. I wasn't running anymore. I wasn't hiding. I was going to find him, because I wasn't just his brother. I was becoming him.